Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and today we're going to be looking at this, which is the Langseax that I've just forged, and I've also completed other bits like the Sheath as well. I say that, but I'll go over other details later. But for starters, we're actually going to look at another blade. Not to show off, but to make a comparison, because this is actually something I am not so happy with, but it shows how I've progressed since earlier days of making blades. So this was previously the largest blade that I've ever made. So it is a sax, so it is the very same design that I've scaled up into the Langseax, so it makes for an excellent direct comparison as well. So we'll firstly just go over the sheath. So it's got something I'll put on my sword later. It's got the chain. So the copper plating that you see here was actually made from copper pipe. You then have, let me take the chain out of the way, these rivets, and those are just pre-purchased rivets from online. Putting the chain back forward, the chain bit going here, this was made from telephone wire, and same with this stuff I got from the scrapyard basically, that had already had its wire, you know, the rubbery stuff stripped, so it was just plain copper wire. So I coiled those and cut them. So the thinner wire I turned into smaller rings for jewellery, and I have now used for this chain. And then the chain rings attaching to the plates, the broader, thicker ones, which I'll show you closer up now, those were made from thicker gauge thicker gauge copper of the same types of wire. So that's what's made this design. So all of this has been made by me by hand. Same with this reddish brown leather, hand stitched with waxed thread, and the copper rivet down here, that is part of something that I was not happy with. So the thread, I've deliberately had it that the edge is against the leather, so it doesn't cut through as easily. And then the back, the spine that's blunt, is against the thread, which you'd think that's fine. But the very point of the knife was starting to try and come through, and then trying to make the whole bit of leather in here, just essentially if I left it untouched from using it and storing it, it would eventually completely open up and this end would be ruined. So I've just secured it as an improvised repair with another copper rivet. So then we'll have a look at the blade. So, standard design of the sax. Usually it's not a full tang, it's a through tang. It's a fairly straight blade. It has a sort of diagonal part that comes from the spine to the point. They can be a little bit more kind of a sudden taper, but they tend, from what I've seen in historical examples, they actually tend to more gradually taper until it gets a fine point, which is interesting considering the fact that you assume those Viking Saxon times people preferred cutting and chopping blades, but yet with that design there wouldn't be as much weight in the tip, because it, rather than suddenly tapering, let me show you that now. Instead of suddenly tapering, it would actually gradually taper. So you can see this, you can see in the bit behind my hand here, there's more material like this, and then if I do it like that, there's less around the tip. So you'd think that would make it worse for cutting and better for thrusting, but the overall design still lends itself very thoroughly to chopping. So anyway, the steel, I have used tool steel. This was made from an old file. So there are a few scratches and marks because I was using an angle grinder to try and level it out. I'm also unhappy with the fact that you'll notice there is a curve in there, so it almost forms an S shape. You've got the curve, a concave curve around the spine here, and then a convex curve where it goes towards the tip. This is partially deliberate because it's supposed to taper to the tip, but you'll notice on the edge it does, after this point, in this particular section, it actually curls around forwards again, and this is actually just poor quality from me. But you then have the full tang, not historically accurate, but there we are, brass pins holding it there, and the wood that has been varnished is ash, just simple English ash that I had obtained. You see a few problems, like there is a little bit here that has come free. That actually broke off while I was affixing the handle, and I super glued it back on. There are also gaps in the tang, quite distinct ones, and the absolute worst gap is right around here. You can see there's a massive, let me try to get the light for you perfectly, there we are. You can see there's a significant gap right on this side, and it's not good. I like the way it curled forward, so it keeps it secure in the hand. Because it is a narrower handle part here, I have had to compensate with the thickness in this dimension, which meant that it is a bit more round in the hand and it rolls a bit. So when I'm trying to cut, although it mostly stays secure in the hand, especially when I do a saber type of thumb grip like that, rather than a hammer grip like that, it still wants to turn and roll as I'm cutting, which is not as good. So now we compare that design to the Langseax that I've designed. Of course, I haven't put the copper fittings on yet, and it's got a brown leather handle. But there are a few improvements. So I'll show you close up. You see at the end here, there's a weird, almost looking like a bulge. You can only see close up, so it shouldn't have a cosmetic effect. But this is that it has folded over. So there was extra material, and then I folded it in. So rather than sewing through 2 layers, this side and this side to seal it up, like on most of the rest of the join here, it's actually got 3 layers. So there was extra material sticking out. I folded it in and then sewn it through. And by having that extra cup in there, rather than it just being against the thread, so you're trying to get the point in there and it starts to cut the thread like on the old one, because it's got the fold in there, when it tries to pierce or cut through, it's going against the leather rather than against the weaker thread. So that makes it more durable. So that's going to help, so I don't need to have a crude looking pin in there or just let it get destroyed. So this is going to last much longer. Apart from that, well, nothing else special about the handle at the moment. So we'll go on to the sword itself, most important thing. So, same kind of design, like I said, just scaled up, so it does curl into the point, whereas it tends to be a more straight, instead of a curved line, it's more of a straight line going from the spine's breadth to the point, in a gradual line. So this isn't quite as historically accurate, so it's copied the same as this. However, you'll notice the blade in general is much straighter. There are some imperfections, of course, but I have made sure to, using things like forging it, so making sure to flatten it on the anvil while I was stretching the length out, flatten it on the anvil, turn it over, flatten it on the anvil, because the anvil was a flat surface and I was able to get that mostly flat. And then there were little bumps and ridges sticking out, and because of the way belt sanders work, I was able to use that to grind it, so any bits that were sticking out, it would just go against those bits protruding first and then gradually wear it back until it was flush with the rest of the spine. So again, there are some imperfections, but if I show you the spine of the blade now, you can see that it is far better. It doesn't curl in any degree, it has very few bumps, and it is a fairly consistent design. And then it curls over towards the tip. And it's also, because of the longer blade, I was able to have it more gradually go towards the tip, so it lends itself to thrusting as well. Polished over, single edge as before, full tang as before. You'll also notice the handle is broader on this dimension, so that means I didn't have to compensate with the thickness as much, so it's more secure in the hand of an oval shape rather than it being rounded and wanting to roll. This one, when I'm chopping, it stays secure in the hand. Additionally, you'll notice I have a more distinct flare in the handle. This again is not historically accurate. It is part of my unique design. I find that flared handles tend to make it stay in the hand better, so that it's, apart from the forward curve that I've put in there, which makes it stay secure in the hand, and the thickness and security of the grip, which makes it stay in the hand, the flaring at the bottom, almost equivalent to a pommel, also helps with that. So I am very confident when I chop. With some swords, I feel a bit worried and I kind of half commit and I feel like it's going to fly out of my hand and kill someone by accident. Whereas with this, it feels much more secure in the hand, no matter how hard I'm chopping with it. The only thing that scares me is just the sheer forward bounce and weight of it, but it's not too heavy in the chop. It's still, you'll see in other videos where I'm test cutting, I'm not sluggish, I'm not lumbering around with it. It is still nimble, it's just less so than certain other types of sword, because it has got it's got some thickness in the spine, and it has, I'll show you, a distal taper starting from here, and then heading towards the point. It still keeps some thickness towards the point, but it still has that distal taper which lends it to have better balance. It won't be quite as good for chopping, but I feel like because of the thickness in the spine and the breadth of the blade as well, there's enough weight, and you can see from the balance point it is very far forward. So it certainly lends itself to cutting. I don't need to worry about the distal taper, so that's fine. So it's actually better to improve the handling rather than add more onto a lot of cutting power. I've also, just like in the other blade, one of the things that's part of my unique style is I have a distal taper in the tang. So it starts thick here, and then it gradually tapers down to here, and it's much thinner. So with less, although it's broader, and it's thicker overall in this bit that flares out so it stays secure in the hand, it's actually lighter because it's mostly wood and not iron that's in that part. So again, this brings the weight further forward, because one of the problems you can get with a full tang is that the thickness of steel added to the handle, especially when you get other fittings and things as well, it makes it more back-weighted. So even for a heavier blade, and supposedly heavier is, you know, the better for chopping and cutting, it's not necessarily the case. And you can have blades that are very heavy, but they're back-weighted, especially when you cut things like basket hilts and whatnot. Back-weighting causes the problem where you're adding weight, so it's a more sluggish and it's more tiring to use, but yet you're not gaining chopping power or cutting ability with it. You're just having dead weight in there. So hence, a distal taper in the tang reduces the effect so that there's less back weighting and you can have more of it going forwards. But yet, with it so thick at the junction where it starts to turn into the blade, it's still got enough thickness in it that it's not likely to bend or snap. So if, you know, you can have the problem where, almost like a dichotomy, too thick, it's back weighted and it isn't nice to handle, too thin, and it's liable to bend around and break and do all kinds of things like that. This is a perfect compromise. It's thin here, where it's not going to take as much stress, and it's thick here, where it's most likely to take a lot of stress. Very nice, I'm very happy with that part of the design. Additionally, I've got copper pins instead of brass pins, and I find they're softer than brass, so they actually mushroom out and squish in better to mechanically secure the handle. So there is a little bit of gap. If I show you, you may at some point see a little bit of light through the tang, because I'm not perfect at my craft, I will admit, but there is still a significantly tighter fit on the actual tang of the handle to the wood scales. And in both cases they are made from ash. Now this is Irish ash rather than the sort of English ash, whatever we've got in here. But instead of using varnish for this kind of less nice looking sort of sheen that's unnatural on it, I've used linseed oil, and that's smoothed over. So it's certainly a sword I'm very happy with, especially considering it's my first ever sword. And of course it fits fairly snugly and securely into the leather sheath. I will very likely at some point add copper fittings, just like on the old Sax, but this is just, it's an enjoyable blade to use. I've done test cutting of it already, and it does have heft, so when you get certain bottles and things, if you want tip speed, or you want a lightweight blade that just goes through easy targets without too much effort, this doesn't lend itself as well to that. But for actual proper chopping and secure cutting that you know is going to go through a target, this lends itself very well to it. So that's that. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you like the design of the sword. I will take it out of the sheath and I'll give you another look at it. So here close up we have the tang and the handle here of the copper pins. I've got here, I didn't mention by the way, there is the ricasso because because of my quenching bucket being about that deep, there was only so far I could harden and temper it. So this bit is unhardened, and I mean, you're not supposed to harden tangs, but this part of the blade isn't hardened either. So if it had a sharp edge, it would basically take dents and it would eventually get chewed up and create weak points. Having a ricasso with thickness here just means that it's going to last longer and it's better for parrying as well. Not that I need to use this in a fight, but you know, just a general design. So back to the view again. So we go along the blade. You can see there are some uneven bits and imperfections, but I'm still fairly happy with the sheen and the general shape and the design. It lends itself to all the things I want. It cuts well, it thrusts well, it handles moderately well for parrying. It does everything I want it to, except having a double edge, but that's the Langseax, it's supposed to be single-edged. So that's that. I hope you enjoyed it, and I shall see you soon, probably for more test cutting with this new sword I've made. Ta-ra!